Okay, welcome back to another swanky edition of covering government topics. Today we're going to this one's 21.2 in your text, quality before the law. If you were in my class of this, we covered in my class, but I'm going to review some of the concepts anyways, just because some of them were a little bit difficult. So this is the sheet that you should have in front of you for taking notes. The sheet I'm going to be referring to on the screen is this one. So you'll just have to follow with the numbers, but it corresponds to this particular sheet. Okay, let's roll. So the equal protection, discrimination by the government, rational basis, strict scrutiny. If you were in my class, we covered this in class, but I'm going to briefly discuss it anyways. Feel free to pause if you need to get anything down at any point. So basically, equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment. Remember, I was saying that the 14th Amendment covers everything that covers the First Amendment for the states. So applies the First Amendment to the states. A series of Supreme Court decisions over from the 1950s forward, basically slowly but surely started applying all the due process rights that are covered in the Bill of Rights to the states, starting with the biggie that we'll discuss shortly. Brown versus Board of Education was the big first major one. So equal protection clause prohibits states from depriving anyone of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Incidentally, just to give a little background, when we're talking about due process of law, we mean two. You don't have to write these down, but we mean two areas: substantive due process, which is like the validity and constitutionality of laws, separate but equal, for example. Does that pass a substantive due process test? And the Supreme Court said no, it does not. And procedural due process, these are the laws about how a criminal, for example, is treated from the beginning of their time to the end of their time. Stuff we covered more in criminology class. Procedural due process that's spelled out in amendments 4 through 8 of the Bill of Rights. So anyways, that's the equal protection clause. But there are limits on discrimination. So discrimination that is reasonable is allowed. So is all discrimination by the government unconstitutional? No. Discrimination that is reasonable is allowed. For example, criminals are treated differently than other citizens. So there is some discrimination that's reasonable, that's allowed according to various Supreme Court decisions and judicial review. Next question asking, what is the rational basis test? What is the strict scrutiny test? We went through this in my class, but just to review, we did an activity with it. And rational basis is a little lesser scrutiny of a test, hence the idea that the burden to discriminate must be proven for, it usually deals with age, wealth, or disability. And you must have a legitimate or rational government interest to discriminate. So, for example, a Utah law in 1975 has overturned that required divorced fathers to support their sons until age 21, as opposed to age 18. Excuse me. 18. There was no rational basis for the divorced fathers to support girls for less time than boys. So the Supreme Court disagreed with the state's rational basis for this. Another one would be an example of statutory rape. And this one saying that the male was charged with statutory rape in a case, in a Supreme Court case. However, it met a policy goal, which was to prevent teenage pregnancy. So the male getting accused of and convicted of statutory rape and the girl having nothing happen to the girl was okay in the Supreme Court's eyes. By contrast, strict scrutiny, the next question, is a little bit more scrutiny. And it is a little more all-encompassing, that test, talking about race, national origin, religion, rights to vote, interstate travel, access to courts. So, for example, the famous case, this is a landmark Supreme Court decision, Loving versus Virginia. States attempt to convince the court of their compelling interest to prohibit interracial marriage. The court said no, that this does not promote any government interest. There's no benefit to this law. It's actually odious to a free people. So they overturned that decision, overturned the state's Virginia's attempt to prohibit interracial marriage, and that has been the law that has stood since 1967. Another example would be an Alabama law that makes it unconstitutional to make women and not men eligible for alimony in the state, and the Supreme Court overturned that. It was a case called Orr versus Orr, and the Supreme Court said, well, no, there's no government interest in saying that only women are eligible for alimony and not men. So rational basis and strict scrutiny, does it cover those? So this, I should have this up as I'm looking at it. Rational basis is standard that courts use to make decisions based on when making decisions that challenge discrimination. Does the action achieve a legitimate government purpose? Does it achieve a legitimate government purpose? That's the question that has to be asked. With strict scrutiny, it's a little higher standard in discrimination cases. Fundamental rights as found in the law or the Constitution, usually dealing with a broader base of people such as race, ethnicity, people with disabilities, and so on. So you might want to pause here if you need to get those two down. I'm going to leave those up for a minute, but if you need to get them down, pause. So the next question then deals with the definitions of segregation and integration. So we're going to shift gears here. Segregation, basically, a lot of this from here on in is stuff that I didn't cover in my class because it's more dealing with stuff that you've had in U.S. history. And so we're going to look at it rather quickly here. So again, if you need to pause any of this, go ahead and do so. I'm just trying to change the view here and the zoom to make sure that when it looks up on your video, you can see it correctly. So integration and segregation. Segregation, separation of one group from another. Integration is the process of bringing a group of people into the mainstream of society. So we'll talk about a few things dealing with separation and integration. If you remember from your U.S. history, again, what are Jim Crow laws? What were the Jim Crow laws? What did the court decide in Plessy versus Ferguson? Jim Crow laws separated people on the basis of race, passed progressively in the late 1800s, if you remember, especially dealing with that separate but equal doctrine, which was actually upheld by the Supreme Court in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson in the late 1800s, which basically said that a Louisiana law requiring rail coaches to be segregated was constitutional. So separate but equal was the law until 1954, the first major case that really dealt with the idea of substantive due process, or making sure that laws that dealt with the Bill of Rights were constitutional. Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, saying the Supreme Court struck down laws requiring separate but equal schools for white and African American students. It made segregated schools illegal, and basically saying, oops, I hit a button there, I apologize. I hit a button there, I apologize, and then moved up my thing to the top. Basically saying that segregated schools are illegal, separate but equal is not inherently equal. And set schools, through a long fight, had to be integrated, or bringing people into the mainstream of society, bringing African Americans into all white schools, bringing them together. The other thing that was de jure versus de facto segregation. Now, even though de jure segregation is now illegal, de facto can still exist. And you see this often happening as a result of a legacy of de jure segregation, where you still have like all neighborhoods that are largely segregated by ethnicity or race. A lot of African American neighborhoods, Mexican neighborhoods, neighborhoods with all white people. Even though discriminatory practices in housing are illegal, and there's still a legacy of that. That you still have segregation that's really still de facto and not necessarily endorsed as a legality. Okay, more on the 19th Amendment and so on in the next video.